right, we're in. Hello, everyone. We are coming in for our second video for our month of October of 2025 here. Unfortunately, I have not quite been able to get around to the way I want to present the one video I talked about going last time, so we may push that off a little further than I wanted to, but that will happen in due time. But as for this week's video, we're going to take a little departure here into the ancient past, and we're going to discuss an aspect of ancient Greece that is quite well known to most people today, but maybe not the inner intricacies of it to a certain degree. And most of us here in the Western world, if you're asked where did democracy start as a form of government, what was one of the first democracies to ever exist in world history, most of us would know off the top of our heads, oh, it started in ancient Greece. And some of us would even know as far as it supposedly started in ancient Athens. And that is true to a large degree. Athens was, of course, not. It maybe was not the first place to have democracy in ancient Greece. That is still debated, but it's definitely one of the more documented cases of democracy in ancient Greece, and it was probably the most developed of any of them. And for today, what I want to go ahead and take a look at here is just some of the inner intricacies of Athenian democracy, how it worked, how it operated, who could participate, and basically just some of the basics on, how was this actually done? Because we know here in the United States, we have something that we call a representative democracy, where we rely on elected representatives to speak for, certain allotments of people of however many they represent. If you're a member of the House of Representatives, you typically represent, the people within your set district within your state. If you're a senator, then you typically represent people across your whole state. But it differs. And then, of course, the president is supposedly supposed to represent most, if not all, of Americans, even though in recent decades that has become a very big issue on both congressional leaders and presidents of whether or not they're actually representing the viewpoints of their constituents or whether or not they just get in there and do what they want. We probably know what the answer is, especially with some of these politicians. They're nothing but paid off by the by the big corporations and big investors that really kind of pay them off and say, "Oh, I'm gonna give you this amount of money in your campaign as long as you don't bring nothing up that's gonna harm me." And we know that to be true. Now, Athenian democracy is much different than American democracy. It is something called a direct democracy, where the people have a lot more individual power in this democracy than the here in the United States, where we just kind of vote and then that representative takes care of the job for us. Where in ancient Athens, the people themselves got a lot more involved and there was a lot more direct voting on matters. So, as I said, let's go ahead and take a look today at some of the inner intricacies of Athenian democracy, maybe see how it is different from what we have here in the United States today, but at the same time, seeing where democracy kind of got its start and seeing, what it started with. Now, Athenian democracy in particular refers to the system of government that was used in the Greek city state of Athens between about the 5th and 4th centuries BC. It existed afterwards as well, but this was the golden era of which democracy flourished largely in Athens. In later years, it struggled to maintain its integrity, and then when the Romans came in, it kind of went out altogether. And before this time period, Athens was not really a democracy quite yet. It was more of an oligarchy, much like Sparta was, its ancient rival. Now, democratic forms of government, as we mentioned, had existed in other Greek states at the time, some perhaps even earlier than Athens itself. City states such as Argos, Rhodes, Syracuse, and Ithrae were some states that also had democratic forms of government along with Athens. Some of them may have even predated it. We're not completely certain over who has the oldest form quite yet. We just know that there is evidence to suggest that some of these states could have had it before Athens did. However, as we did say, Athenian democracy, it was the most developed among the ancient Greek city states that had this system of government because it also involved all male citizens within the city state. Any male citizen above the age of 18 was eligible to participate in Athenian democratic procedures. It is also, of course, the most well documented from the time, probably partly given to the factor that Athens was one of the most important, probably one half of the most important of the Greek city states. We all know our ancient Greek history that, yes, there were multiple Greek city states, but the two that were probably the most powerful throughout that civilization period was, of course, Athens on one side and Sparta on the other. We kind of know that from our common history. Now, for Athenian democracy, democracy in itself is a Greek word. It is a combination of two Greek words. The word demos, which means people in the Greek language, and kratos, or rule in the Greek language. So people rule is what it essentially means in the word democracy, which is a combination of these words, or Demokratia. In Athens, any male citizen could participate in the main democratic body, which was called the assembly or ekklesia. And Athens held, and at the time of Athenian democracy being in its golden era between the 5th and 4th centuries BC, it held a male population of roughly 30 to 60,000 males that lived within the city at that time that were eligible to partake in this democratic government. Now, the Athenian Assembly, or Ecclesia, it met twice a month. Well, not twice a month. It met at least one time a month. It could be twice. It could even be as many as times as three, but it would meet at least once a month, and it would meet at a place called the Pnyx, which was a rocky hill in the middle of Athens that could hold and accommodate over 6,000 citizens at a time, where they would all gather. And this is where the assembly would actually do their business. Any citizen could speak to the Athenian assembly, and they could also, any eligible male voter or any eligible male citizen could also, while attending these assembly meetings, could vote on decisions by raising their hand in favor or against measures that were being proposed. Votes were by simple majority, with any decision taken by the assembly largely being considered final. The assembly itself was also headed by a total of 9 presidents, or prodroi, which were elected by lot. They could hold office, though, only one time. They could not run for repeated office, and they were basically the ones in charge of organizing proceedings and assessing voting that happened within the assembly. Athenian democracy, as we mentioned, it's a direct democracy compared to the representative democracy that is seen here in the United States today. Now, prior to, I believe it was the 500s BC, Athens had had an oligarchy government, and it slowly, gradually got changed around. And the man that is credited in large part for starting the democratic reforms in Athens to get democracy started there is this man here. And this is a man called Cleisthenes, who was an Athenian politician at the time, and he is largely considered the father of Athenian democracy and the father of democracy as a whole, because he is the one that kind of starts Athens toward the path of that government at about the 500s BC, late or early 400s BC, about that time frame. He's the one that sets it on the path that it will eventually take. Now, the Pnyx in Athens, it still exists. It is, of course, not in as grand of shape as it probably would have been back in the day. It was a much more popular site back in the day, obviously. But here is a picture from modern day of what is left in Athens of the Pnyx, where the ancient Athenian Assembly would, or Ecclesia would meet and hold their government, meetings and procedures. So it does exist. It's kind of a rocky outcropping. Not too different, I think, from the Acropolis where the Parthenon is. Now, the Athenian Assembly, it would discuss many issues, and the issues that the assembly would discuss could vary extremely widely. It was no certain set of things that they could discuss. The assembly would discuss matters as wide and varied as needed to be, and things that they would discuss, for example, could include some of these subjects. They might discuss financial magistries, military matters, legislation, political trials, organizing and maintaining food supplies into the city of Athens, spending or raising funds, on sending envoys, or whether or not deciding to sign or not to sign treaties with other Greek city-states. Now, the assembly would also have the power to do something that was called ostracize, which today we would just know as exile. It was what they called, and if you were ostracized from Athens, you were exiled from Athens. You were banned from the city. You could not return, and only in the assembly had this power to ostracize any Athenian citizen who became either too powerful or became a threat to the city of Athens itself, or the polis. Now, Ostracisms would use secret ballots. They were not publicly, they were not by a raising of hands, they were not done in a public manner. They were done by secret ballots where voters would write a name on a piece of broken pottery, something that we would call an ostracon. And on these ostracons, they would write the name of whoever it was that they were in favor of ostracizing. These ostracons would be collected, and then they would assess the vote based on, okay, so many ostracons, whoever has more in favor of this person is going to get ostracized. And sometimes that was a good thing, other times it was not. There were actually a couple times that the Athenians made the mistake of ostracizing some figures that perhaps they probably should not have ostracized. Now, freedom of speech was an important element in Athenian democracy. It was an important element, especially in assembly debates, and was a valued privilege. Decrees or laws were adopted after ample debate in the assembly. They were not just proposed and a vote was put forward. No, they gave time to actually debate these things before they went ahead and just smashed them together. And the assembly was responsible for ensuring the enforcement of any decisions that it made in terms of law. Now, that was the assembly. Now, the assembly had a smaller body within the assembly, and this was called the I don't even know if I'm getting this one right, but it is typically spelled boule or boule. I don't know how exactly they pronounce it. I apologize if the pronunciation is off, but I'm going to call it a boule. And the boule was a smaller body in Athenian democracy that was not as decision making as the assembly, but it was still critical to the operation of this government. Now, the Boule would decide or prioritize topics which were discussed by the assembly. So it basically set the agenda, so to speak. It would set the agenda for what the day's proceedings were going to actually discuss. So if there was a topic on military matters that needed to be discussed, the Boule would recommend, okay, this needs to be the first order of business when we convene the assembly. So kind of like the agenda setters, they're kind of like the top people setting the agenda for the day for a meeting or whatever. The Bulle could also make decisions on its own, but only during times of war or crisis. This was the only two instances where the Bulle could make its own decisions without the need of the assembly. And it was comprised of only 500 citizens, and Bole would also be another word for simply for council, so we'll call it the council here. And 500 citizens would be all that comprised the Bole, compared to, however many male voters were in the city of Athens that could at any time come together on the Pnyx and, partake in that, which it said it could accommodate 6,000, but there was more than 6,000 eligible people that could participate. Now, each of the 500 citizens who comprised the council or boule would be chosen by lot. They would serve for 1 year terms with a limitation of no more than 2 consecutive years. They would represent 139 districts in Attica, which was the region that Athens was in, and would act as an executive committee. They would supervise administrative committees and officials in the process. Now, the Athenian court system would balance the boule. It would be kind of this counterbalance to the council and the assembly. And of course, you need that. You need a checks and balances system in any democracy here in the United States. I mean, it actually astonishes me how many people are grown adults and do not know their three branches of government. It honestly astonishes me how bad that is. But on the other end, it is not. But we know here in the United States, we have checks and balances between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. This was no different in ancient Athens. The Athenians had their own methods for having a separate, checks and balances system in order to check the power of both the executive council and to check the power of the assembly or the ecclesia. And this was their court system. The law courts or dicasteria, they composed of about 6,000 jurors and chief magistrates or archai. They were chosen annually by lot and at random. These courts were never preset in stone. They were never preset over who was going to preside on them, who was going to be a juror, who was going to be an archai. It was entirely chosen by random. The courts were a place where the assembly passed laws could be challenged by ordinary citizens, and final decisions regarding ostracisms, naturalization, and debt issues could also be dealt with. So the courts were kind of the check on the power. If a law was drastically unfair that was passed by the assembly, the courts could say, "Hey, I hate to do this to you, but no, we're not keeping this law because this is causing an issue." The random selection of the courts and the limited terms of office for both the jurors and the archives made it bribery very difficult on these courts because people didn't know who to bribe, for one thing, because it was entirely selected at random. You could put all the money you wanted into a person. There was no guarantee that they were going to end up on that court because you had no it wasn't like you were campaigning to go on there, not like you would nowadays, where you could bribe an official that's campaigning and put a lot of money into it. This was not the case back then, so it was pretty hard to bribe any of these court officials because you didn't know who was going to end up being on the court. And it was hard for individual groups to dominate or, influence decision making in government because of these same issues. So it made bribery and influencing very difficult because A, you didn't know who was going to get on the court. And second, their terms are limited as it is. It's not like they're going to be able to stay on there very long to help you. So that did cause, it kind of checked a little bit on any corruption that might come about. Not to say that corruption did not exist. Obviously, it was a democracy. Corruption's going to exist in some form. We have it in today's democracy in every bit of form. But it made it harder for it to actually happen. And here, let's see here. I think we got a picture here. We don't have a whole lot of pictures today. I don't think it's going to be the longest of videos. Just something I wanted to take a brief kind of look at. Here is an image of what an ostracon would look like. So this was a piece of a broken pottery that during an ostracism, the people would actually take, one of these broken pieces and scribe the name of who it was that they thought should be ostracized. These would then be collected, and these ostracons would then be assessed and tabulated and determining who had more in favor of being ostracized. And that would determine who. Now, this particular ostracon is one that was cast for ostracizing the Athenian general Themistocles, who had won a great battle, who had been one of the main victors at the Battle of Marathon. He ended up, after the First Persian War, he ended up becoming kind of a rogue in Athens. He became very much an enemy of certain politicians, and eventually they ostracized him. He was officially ostracized. He got exiled from Athens and sent to Argos. And that particular ostracon was one that was cast in favor of his ostracism. Now, in terms of participation, we kind of touched upon this a little bit already. As we said, any male citizen of Athens who was at least 18 years of age could participate in Athenian democratic procedures and processes. However, while that sounds simple, it didn't necessarily mean that everybody was partaking like they should. Just like today's democracy. I mean, there's plenty of eligible voters, but not everyone is registered to vote, and not everyone that is registered to vote chooses to vote, which is another problem. You complain about, not liking the way the government is. Well, did you vote? Did you do anything? Did you actually, make your voice heard? Did you try? If you just sat at home and want to complain about it, but didn't, but you had the opportunity to go vote and you didn't take it, you see where some of the criticism can come from. Magistrates and jurors, however, although in terms of participating, you had to be at least 18. If you were going to be a magistrate or a juror on an Athenian court, you had to be at least age 30. And of course, only men were allowed, so that excludes women. Women could not vote. They could not have any part in the democratic government procedures. Slaves were also not able to partake, and any resident foreigners from other city-states were not allowed to partake in Athenian democratic processes. You had to be an Athenian citizen. Now, the Athenians held democratic government in such esteem during their time that they even had a patron goddess of it. They had Demokratia. She was a patron goddess of democracy that they ended up kind of building multiple statues to and kind of observing. Now, while active participation was encouraged in Athenian democratic procedures, much like here in the United States, where we try to encourage the people to use your right to vote, use your right to protest, make your voice heard, there were instances where this did not happen, and in ancient Athenian democracy, when this would not happen, assembly attendance was even paid in order to get people to actually attend these meetings of the ekklesia. The payment would encourage citizens who lived far away or couldn't afford the regular time off to take part in assembly meetings to actually come out and attend them. However, the money that was paid to them would only cover expenses and travel or money loss that they would not be making, to take time out of their busy schedule to actually come and attend this meeting. Any money that they would lose by, not being at their shop or, tilling their field or whatever else would be compensated, but it was not essentially for profit. You weren't just going to get extra money on the side. You were only going to get the money that, coming to this meeting was actually costing you, covering your expenses. Now, although citizens of Athens accounted for roughly 10 to 20% of Athens's population during the heyday golden age of Athens and golden age of its democracy, only around 3,000 of them actively partook in Athenian democracy. So, although we said in terms of male, a male citizen, a male population of roughly 30 to 60,000 Athenians lived there during that time period, maybe only 3,000 of them were actually partaking in this process. And because of the low numbers of participation in Athenian democracy, it left the door open to more famous, more wealthy individuals to kind of dominate the political arena within Athens. They were a group of as few as 100 citizens, often the wealthiest and the most influential, who would end up dominating the arena in the absence of more of the common folk who did not have the money and other reasons. The wealthy, influential speakers would often even meet secretly in order to avoid speaking publicly, which could lead to accusations of them conspiring to create tyranny or it possibly lead to an ostracism vote on them. Now, there were critics of Athenian democracy. There were plenty of critics during its heyday, and some of them were even Athenian voices themselves. Famous voices such as the Athenian general Thucydides, who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. The playwright Aristophanes would also be a very heavy critic of Athenian democracy and how it kind of let open for other things to come. Even the philosophers Plato and Aristotle would end up being critics of the way democracy was actually carried out in Athens. And they pointed to several issues as why they had such a criticism of it. Number one, the proceedings were increasingly dominated by an elite, wealthy group within Athenian politics. Not that much different from here in the United States today, despite it being a different form of democracy. Number two, people could be very easily swayed by good orators or popular leaders, or even by emotions or lack of knowledge, something that I think heavily weighs on the United States today, as we have seen extensively. I hate to say it, but we've seen it extensively with our current president. He lacks a knowledge in a lot of things, but he's a very popular leader. He's not exactly a good orator, but he's a popular leader. And whatever he says, people tend to take as truth. They tend to, he's good at swaying a crowd to his point of view. Is it necessarily the best point of view? In my opinion, it's not always been the correct point of view. Sometimes it's actually pretty messed up. But nonetheless, he's been able to sway the people. And that is something that Aristotle and Plato and Thucydides and Aristophanes, they all saw this. And they said, now in their time, they're talking about different leaders. They're talking most notably perhaps about Pericles, who had kind of led the Athenians to establish an empire over the other Delian League states, led into the Peloponnesian War. He would end up leading Athens for the first 2 years of that war before he ended up dying. And at the end of the Peloponnesian War, guess what? Athens was beaten by Sparta and fell into ruin for a time. But this was a very big issue that they had, and it plays true today. There are certain leaders who they're not that good of leaders, but they're popular orators and they're able to sway a crowd to their point of view, mostly because sometimes the crowd has very little knowledge over whatever talking point they're talking about. And that could be an issue. Another issue that they would bring up would be the execution of successful Athenian generals and citizens that had nothing to do wrong with Athenian society, but they were wrongly executed or ostracized anyway due to popular sentiment. One of these, of course, that would have impacted especially the critics Plato and Aristotle would have been the whole thing that happened with Socrates. Socrates had been Plato's teacher, Plato had been Aristotle, so of course he would have passed on, I'm sure, the story. And Socrates had been one of Athens' greatest thinkers. However, he challenged Athenian authority at times through his way of thinking. The Athenian authorities held a trial for him. It wasn't even an ostracism. They held a trial. They ultimately determined that he had in some way violated Athenian law and he was a danger to Athens. So they decided, yep, you're going to get a death sentence. And they executed the guy simply for his way of thinking. And that was not necessarily the best thing. Another thing that happened, there was a time that several successful Athenian generals ended up getting executed on a whim just due to popular sentiment, despite the factor that they had won a major battle. Despite the fact that they had won several major victories for Athens, the popular sentiment was swayed by powerful orators who were able to get the crowd to turn against them and get them executed anyway. So, because of these criticisms, you can kind of see where some of the criticisms were to lie. It was not a perfect system. Neither is our system today. No democracy is ever perfect. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, as was said in the Federalist Papers. But it does definitely have its issues. And for instance, this is the guy that, in some ways, he is considered one of the greatest champions of Athenian democracy, but in other ways, he's also possibly, especially to his critics, one of the biggest dangers to Athenian democracy, and that was the great Pericles of Athens. Pericles, as we just mentioned, kind of led Athens to the height of its golden era, but he also led it into the Peloponnesian War. And he did face accusations at the time that he and his wealthy, influential friends were kind of pulling the strings of Athenian government and enriching themselves. Whether that was ever proven is up for debate. Now, during the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, Athenian democracy would struggle to survive, and ultimately Sparta would win that war. And in 411 BC, oligarchy was officially adopted to attain Persian support against Sparta. Democracy would eventually return to Athens in the decades and centuries that came after, but it would be more limited than it had been before. And by the time the Romans came in there, and I think the first century BC, I think, is when the Romans ended up coming into Greece, the Romans, once they took full control, they pretty much wiped away any trace of the Athenian democracy and put it under the Roman governance of law, which was very strictly, to the imperial emperor or to the Senate back in Rome, I think, at the time. But it was increasingly becoming more direct, not less democratic, and more in the lines of what the Romans thought government was. So, Athenian democracy, it lasted its golden age for about 2 or 3 centuries. It did have its struggles, it had its issues, but in large part, it was a functioning system. And for the time, being one of the first democracies to ever come to the world stage, it was a quite impressive system that it managed to survive as long as it did and function successfully in such a manner as it did. But that is what I wanted to do today, was take a brief look at that, a brief look at Athenian democracy, a brief look at how democracy got its start, how it kind of operated, and just to see a little bit of the differences and similarities that it shares with what we see today here in the United States and other democratic countries here in the West, even across other areas of the world. But that is all I wanted to go ahead here today. So not the longest video, but definitely something I wanted to go ahead and take a look at. So if anyone has any questions, any added information, anything of that manner, feel free to put it into the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to look through them when I get the opportunity to do so. Next week is the week of Halloween. I do not know if we're doing a Halloween themed video this year or if we're just going to plunge ahead with a normal video. I have not made that decision yet, honestly. So I guess I'll have to come to that decision here within a week's time. Again, if anyone has any suggestions, feel free to put it in there, and I'll be more than happy to possibly do a video on it if I think that it's good enough to actually take a good look at. But again, hopefully that gives everyone a better idea of how Athenian democracy operated, at least on a basic level, and I think accomplishes the task for today. So with nothing else to be said, I think yep. So with nothing else to be said, hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video that ends up coming out for the last video for the month of October.